Hey Kim, what's on your radar?
Please comply with COVID rules. Control your soul's desire for freedom. That is what is being said by this messenger drone above Shanghai. Control your soul's desire for freedom. Is that shocking to you? I think for most of us it is. Yet so many in our own country spouted similar messages during the lockdowns here in America. Maybe you remember all of the people making fun of those of us who were against draconian lockdowns and vaccine mandates. They'd mock us by sending clever tweets like this: anti-science, backwards thinking, because freedom. Hey, anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers, are you going to refuse protection from nuclear fallout too? You know, because freedom. Dear all anti-vaxxers, because freedom people and Fox News truck convoy fanatics, I beg you, do not get the vaccine. Let Darwin decide. That guy actually won the 2018 Pulitzer Prize in criticism. I kid you not. Do you think these same people are now cheering the drone hovering above the millions in China, telling them to control their soul's desire for freedom? Or do you think they see this and intuitively know something is seriously wrong? People in Shanghai, who, by the way, are not MAGA hat-wearing right-wing Trump supporters, are realizing something is wrong, and they're getting desperate. They're protesting in the streets, demanding the restrictions be lifted. And here they are collectively screaming from their apartments in protest. During the lockdowns here in the United States, when people were losing their jobs, grocery store shelves were empty, and even beaches and playgrounds were being shut down, CNN jumped in to criticize and shame people who protested the measures. Now they seem shocked by China's similar behavior.
The scale of this lockdown is just staggering. You've got 25 million residents in Shanghai locked in indefinitely. This is in China's most populous and cosmopolitan city, and people there, they're feeling helpless and frustrated, but much of the dissent is being censored.
Selena Wang there could have been describing New York City, Los Angeles, or any other major liberal-run city during the spring-summer lockdowns of 2020. People feeling helpless, frustrated, unable to get daily essentials or even medical care, and being censored on social media. So let's face it, parts of the U.S. and certainly Europe weren't that far off from what we're now seeing in China. What's even more alarming is many in this country wished we would have gone further and created quarantine camps for people with or suspected of being infected with COVID. Now, to be clear, China is worse. Some localities have gone a step further. Now, if you're an animal lover, what I'm about to show you is devastating, so be forewarned. Some ultra-authoritarian local authorities in Shanghai have been rounding up COVID-positive people's house pets and murdering them, oftentimes inhumanely. Here they are rounding up those house cats, throwing them in bags where they await their extermination. Dogs are being killed on sight, sometimes brutally. This is all in an effort to stop the spread. Now, I have to admit, I've known since the beginning of the pandemic that house pets can carry and transmit COVID to humans. The science was actually always clear on that. However, I decidedly did not report on this out of fear people in this country would take it as far as China and advocate for our furry family members to be euthanized. It seems ludicrous that anyone would advocate for something so monstrous, but nearly everything that once seemed ludicrous, like draconian lockdowns and vaccine mandates, happened. So I didn't put it past people and didn't want to take the risk. Now, fear has caused many to behave in ways that maybe otherwise they wouldn't. It's part of the human condition. No matter what your skin color or nationality is, this pandemic has made that obvious. It's never a good idea to make decisions out of fear. They're rarely good decisions, and they usually lead to giving up freedoms in the name of safety. And who knows when we're getting them back, if ever. Now, to give China some credit, they at least recognize freedom is a desire of the soul and not some made-up MAGA talking point. That's more than we can say for the people in this country who throughout the pandemic politicized freedom and instead have turned it into a dirty word. And where does that leave us? If freedom is just a right-wing talking point rather than a unifying message of what America stands for, how can we possibly hope to maintain it? How can we possibly proclaim ourselves to be a democracy and a free country while mimicking China's very anti-democratic measures? Are the pro-lockdown people watching China now and realizing their massive mistakes and advocating for it? or do they somehow think it was still justified, or maybe even somehow different? That is my big question, Robbie and Brianna, on this one is, China looks pretty darn dystopian, and the things that they're doing really, really horrific. I mean, that drone shouting from the sky, telling people, just curb your soul's desire for freedom. That seems really insane. But at the same time, 2 years ago, it wasn't that much different here in the United States, certainly not different in places like Australia and New Zealand. Do you think people now are looking back, watching what's happening in China, and then saying, people that were very pro-lockdown, do you think they're now saying, okay, maybe that wasn't exactly the best decision? Or do you think they're thinking, no, that's different?
I mean, it scares me greatly that despite how, I would say, tyrannical and unacceptable the COVID restrictions were in the U.S., and you and I were both very critical of them from an early point, despite how bad they were, the U.S.'s restrictions were like in one of the least stringent categories when you compare to places like you've described, like Australia, like what China is doing still at this late date, pursuing a impossible COVID zero strategy, or a strategy that involves, losing so many freedoms, so much enjoyment of life as to not be worth it. And it's disturbing, but you make a very good point that, despite the kind of criticism of that policy we're getting from mainstream Americans, liberal Americans, they were for, maybe not for the some of the excesses, the murdering pets, that kind of thing, but they were saying, you're the Grim Reaper if you're at the beach. Like, that was a common thing 2 summers ago. Totally wrong, but common thing, pushed by our media.
Yeah, it feels like there's two things. There was some of the COVID misinformation and overstating of facts, the Grim Reaper at the beach, the misinformation about what was going on with pets. I remember being told very clearly that pets could not transmit COVID in the beginning, but I guess that's been revised. All of the masking back and forth and all of that has caused a certain degree of skepticism and a lack of confidence in the CDC and the people who are advising us to begin with. That, combined with the restrictions on freedoms, puts people in a very kind of reactive, disgruntled place. But Kim, your radar raises this other issue for me, which is this push and pull between the idea of positive freedoms and negative freedoms. The freedom to own a gun and also the freedom to be safe from random acts of gun violence. The freedom to, let's say, not have to, from being hungry or having to, go without health insurance versus, let's say, whether or not you are forced to pay into a Medicare for All program or something like that. And depending on where you are in your life, people weight and judge and assess something as a positive freedom or a negative freedom and as more important or less important. And it seems to me that the balance here is always trying to figure out, how do you make it so that people can make the kinds of choices that enable them to feel safe and happy without feeling like they are forced to make some of those choices. So that when we've looked at the way that COVID was handled in other parts of the world, I would like to be able to incentivize people to limit their exposure to folks, to not go to work with COVID by saying, okay, we're going to give you economic support. We're going to send groceries to your house. We're going to allow you to live in a way that is conducive to health and safety without saying you must do this. You are mandated to do X, Y, and Z. And I wonder what you make of people who are trying to achieve that balancing act in good faith, as opposed to some of those glib, kind of mean-spirited tweets that you read during your segment.
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that even countries that are very authoritarian, where I think you and I would absolutely agree there are no freedoms in those countries, or they very much are limited. For example, places like Saudi Arabia, many would say that about China and many of these other places. Those countries would say their citizens have freedom. So, they would never say, oh, no, they don't have freedom when we're an authoritarian country. Every leader, every government says, no, our people are free. They have a level of freedom. And it's because they have made those assessments and they've said, okay, which level of freedom is acceptable? And they have determined that the level they've given their population is acceptable, and anything beyond that is not acceptable. So to them, they are still very much free. So I think it's, that's where it gets really difficult, right? Is saying, okay, well, at what level would you consider it freedom in a country? Do you consider Saudi Arabia free? They would absolutely say that their people are free, even though they're obviously, to me, not. But to them, they are. Chinese people, exactly the same thing. When you talk to many of them, they'll say, no, we're free. You guys have a misconception about us. And then, well, do you have the freedom to browse the internet as you wish? Do you have the freedom to say what you want, right? And they don't, but they sit there and they'll tell you, no, we're totally free. You guys have misconceptions. So that is a good question, Brianna. We do have to, as a society, determine what level of freedom is appropriate for being America, what we deem and what we pride ourselves on being a free country. But I don't know, it's a good discussion.
It's true. It's certainly true. There are misconceptions about China that Americans have. There are misconceptions about Saudi Arabia that we have.
Although I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and I do remember the National Geographics being blocked out in the grocery store. I can vouch for those limitations.
Well, right, which is why I always push against moral relativism, despite the U.S.'s considerable flaws and the many criticisms we have of our government and what our government does in places like the Middle East. I still feel justified in saying that I am glad we enjoy, on the whole, more freedoms than people in a lot of these repressive places, despite, I'm sure the North Korean government assuring their people they enjoy freedom, the freedom to live free of Western influence or something like that. But no, they clearly have less freedom than we do. They have a deplorable lack of freedom, and it is fine to say that. Just because the U.S. government is flawed doesn't prohibit us from taking that view, which is correct.
Well, we always have to keep fighting for our freedom, but it's also important to remember that places like, it wasn't just Saudi Arabia or China or Australia. I mean, Italy, Spain, they did really strict lockdowns that look a lot like what's going on in China. I mean, people were, they, like in China, we're seeing videos of people actually rappelling their dogs from the windows to try to get them outside to be able to go on little walks outdoors. We saw those same images coming out of Spain and Italy. They weren't, especially Spain, they weren't allowed to go outside to even walk their dogs. So they were literally rappelling them out the balcony. Even Western countries that say that they're liberal democracies looked a lot like China during the lockdowns.
No, Europe locked down harder than we did, but then they didn't mask kids as aggressively as we did in the U.S. So there is some mixed policies.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, thank you, Kim, and we'll have more Rising in just a minute.